Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, I'm talking to Helen Lewis about one of her favourite political fictions, a novel that is much loved. It used to be universally loved, but now is increasingly controversial. To Kill a Mockingbird. We're going to be talking about what it says about the America of the South at the time it was set, but why people have increasingly come to reject the picture it paints of that political and racial order. Is it, in fact, apologizing for the thing that most people believed it was criticizing? Are its critics right? I have to admit, I can't remember when I first read To Kill a Mockingbird. I'll tell you in a minute about when I last read it, which finished about 3 hours ago. I know I must have read it at school, but do you remember when you first read it?
I think I was about 7 or 8 when I first read it. I was one of those kids that just read absolutely everything. So I've acquired huge amounts of knowledge from like Reader's Digest medical compendiums and stuff like that. Just anything that we didn't have a lot of books in my house when I was growing up, so I would just sort of read any of them. And I think that's when I picked it up. And it's a really great book from that perspective. And there were just a lot of things I didn't get, but it's framed, because it's so strongly framed through Scout's narration, you don't feel kind of bad about that as a child when you're reading it, because obviously there's a lot of things that she doesn't understand either.
And then you came back to it when? I mean, is it one that you've come back to through your life? So I have to say, I read it, I'm guessing 30 plus years ago. And then I've seen the film a few times, like a lot of people, and the film clouds your memory of the book, because rereading it now, there's so much more in the book and there are so many scenes that aren't in the film. Is it one that you've come back to? Is it like a touchstone book for you, or is it one that you just have in the back of your mind?
I definitely read it a couple of times. I think I also learned it, in school too. And I reread it again just now and picked up a load more stuff for it that I just hadn't read. And I don't know about how you feel about this, but I think the kind of when things are a incredibly brilliant piece of art, often the thing that's kind of amazing about them is they're like a sort of F1 engine, right? Everything is tuned up. There's not a kind of bit in them that you just think, oh, I wish it was great apart from that. Everything works together seamlessly. Just so to give you one example, quite early on in the book, Scout brings home Walter Cunningham, one of the kids in her class from school. Now, he's from the sort of respectable poor people who would never say that they didn't have the money for the school lunch, would never take money for the school lunch. And she brings him home and then they feed him. And that pays off way down the line when Walter Cunningham's dad is part of the lynch mob that tries to come and take Tom Robinson, who's in the prison, and Atticus Finch, her father, is waiting, outside to intercept them. And she starts talking about his entail and his court problems and how his son's doing. And that's the moment that kind of humanizes him back out of this kind of thoughtless lynch mob attendee back into a kind of human being again. And so when I reread it this time, I was surprised actually how slow the beginning of the novel is. There's a lot of luxuriating just in Scout's beginning of her school year. But it's a bit like, they always say that Back to the Future is the perfect screenplay because everything that's set up at the beginning pays off at the end. And that's very true, I think, of To Kill a Mockingbird too. Everything that's there in what looks like a kind of just gentle stroll through Southern life in the 1930s becomes vitally important for understanding things that happen later.
My experience of rereading it, and I finished it, the rereading this morning, was like you, I saw all these things that I didn't know were in the book, scenes, characters I'd forgotten about. The perfection of it really struck me. But I was also reading it partly for this podcast and noticing things like references to the New Deal and stuff like that. We might come on to that. And I was sort of annoyed with myself for reading it in this analytical middle-aged man way. And then if you'd seen me 3 hours ago, I was crying my eyes out because when she says, "Hey, boo," even as I say it now, I can feel the tears pricking in my eyes. Almost to within 20 pages of the end, I was still a bit annoyed at myself that I hadn't quite, and then it just got me in a way that I don't think it even would have got me earlier in my life. And even in a way that the film, I don't think has ever made me cry. And it was the words, "Hey, boo," that did it. It's amazing the way this book, particularly the last 20, 30 pages, just can grab you.
When I was rereading it, it reminded me of another book I read recently, which was The Beginning of Spring, which is set in the eve of the Russian Revolution and has one straightforward plot. And then it has one completely bizarre scene in it in which the central character goes out to the woods and kind of spirits sort of sport them. And it's never explained about whether or not this is a dream. Is this something that's supposed to happen? Is it supernatural? And I feel like the character of Boo Radley is very similar to that. Now, One of the things that I struggle with this time is the book says that he always stays indoors because he doesn't want to come out. They spend all the time, this kid's trying to get him to come out. And then the, metaphorical thing is maybe the world's too scary for Boo Radley. It's that he's consciously rejected it. But then I found that this time I put that together with the fact that the inciting incident for why he ends up staying indoors is that he's supposed to be very wild in his youth. And he went out in this gang and he got into drinking, which presumably was during Prohibition. And then, and so instead of going to the local technical college, which we're told all the other kids in the gang who went to actually ended up getting quite good jobs and quite a good education, his father says, I'm going to keep you at home. And then when his father dies, his brother comes back and keeps him. And so there is a kind of overtone there of whether or not, is that a family with a very dominant, violent patriarch? And the idea was that Boo Radley was kind of disciplined very harshly. The other thing that I began to wonder, just because of other things in the book, is that he does seem, I don't know what the way to say this is now, by the end, he seems quite simple. And I wonder if we're also supposed to think that perhaps he was beaten so badly by his father that he had brain damage. And that's another reason why he hasn't come out.
I find myself thinking exactly the same thing. One of the questions I was going to ask you is, what do you think had happened to Boo? And actually, right at the end, I found myself thinking, so yeah, he's wild as a young man. And I think he's briefly sent away. Was he lobotomized? I mean, I think it's unlikely, but it's possible in this context. But definitely something has happened to him. He becomes, for everyone else, a metaphor for their views about what it is to struggle to exist in this world. But something happened to Boo, because he is, at the end, it's quite clear he's not all there, which is part of why I was crying my eyes out.
Yeah, it's very sweet that Scout has learned this lesson to not be afraid of difference, right? And it's another kind of emphasis of the book's themes, which is that children have to be taught by other people to be afraid of people who aren't like them. And that applies to somebody like Boo just as much as it applies to the black people who live beyond the dump past where the Yules live. But I like the light touch and the fact that you are left to make up your own decisions about Boo. Because the trouble with this kind of book, which is a didactic book, right? It is obviously there to teach. Well, it's there to teach white children a lesson about racism, but that it allows you to sit with this thing that is never really spelled out, and you have to kind of come and meet it halfway. And again, that's something that I just think, if we talk about Shakespeare, what people love about Hamlet is the ambiguity of it, right? The fact that you have so many different interpretations. And I think that the same thing is true of Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird.
As you said, when you first read it, you were roughly the age that Scout is at the beginning of the book. Reading it now, one of the many ways it's different to read it as an adult or to read it many years on is there has been quite a lot of revisionism around this book, and a book that maybe 30, 40 years ago was a relatively uncomplicated morality tale about racism has become very, very complicated and implicated in arguments, among other things, about American history and the history of the South. They don't turn on Scout. I don't think there's been much revisionism of Scout as a character, though we're going to come on to the weird prequel book called Go Set A Watchman. Once you've read that, it's hard to think of Scout in the same light. But the focus of it is the character of Atticus Finch, the central character in the book. I think much of the reason why this book is so magical, it's hard to think of another character like him in modern literature. But people have increasingly, and books have been written called things like the biography of Atticus Finch, questioned his motivation. Now, again, there is a clearer explanation in the prequel that we can come on to. But when you read To Kill a Mockingbird now, so one way to frame this question is, what do you think is his motivation in defending Tom Robinson? Because he actually gives a range of different answers as to what he's doing. And just to give an example, so the back of the Penguin edition I've got summarizes him thus. The conscience of a town steeped in prejudice, violence, and hypocrisy is pricked by the stamina of one man's struggle for justice. Now, I don't think that anything in that is right, but I don't think it is in any sense a struggle for justice if by that what they mean is racial justice. What do you understand as his motivation in defending Tom Robinson?
I think it springs from a kind of feeling that there are rules that everybody should play by, a kind of deep attachment to the idea of the rule of law and that people should be entitled to a certain justice. But that's inflected by the fact, this is one of the things I want to talk about this time reading it through. I was so much more aware of class, the class structures within the white people in this novel. And I think that a big part of why he depends him is that he thinks that a respectable Negro like Tom Robinson is worth more than white trash like the Yules. And that it is a reordering. It's not a complete reordering, right? Because I think that there is still feeling that there is a white hierarchy and a kind of patrician feeling of kind of looking after those less able to do so than you. So I think he still puts himself at the top of that hierarchy, but I think he probably would put a respectable black family above a non-respectable white family. That's a big challenge to make him, isn't it? Because there's a line in it where it says, when it push comes to shove, a white jury will always side with a white family, and that race is more important than the fact that everybody in Macomb thinks the Urals are a pretty bad business.
And I should say we're going to use the language of the book here, though not all of the language. Some of it we won't use. But I was also struck by that phrase. It comes up in the trial. One of the things that he says in defense of Tom Robinson is that a respectable Negro would never go into the house of a white family uninvited. So if part of the accusation against him is that he came into that house uninvited, it's not true. It's also the case that early on, when he takes the case and the kids become aware that their father is becoming a bit of a pariah in the town because he's defending this black man who's been accused of raping a white woman, he says to his children, I wish I didn't have to do this. At one point, I think he says, I was hoping to get through my career without having to take one of these cases, but it's my duty. And if there's justice here, it's what he says is justice to himself and to the Finches and to their idea of what kind of white family that they are. There's a lot in the book where Atticus kind of says, I couldn't look anyone in the eye, I couldn't look my children in the eye if I didn't do this thing. But I wish I didn't have to do it. And that really comes across, I think. He's not reluctant. Once he does his duty, he's a man who will do his duty, and he's brave, he's physically brave, he sees off the lynch mob with the aid of his children. But nonetheless, it's not a crusade for justice, and it's also deeply fatalistic. So all the way along, he says, I know I'm not going to win. I might save him the chair. I might not save him from the chair. We might be able to take it to a higher court. It's like we have to go through the motions. And I thought the most depressing paragraph in the whole book is right towards the end, where Jem, his son, who sat through the trial with Scout, they've sat up with the black families who are segregated in the balcony upstairs. And they've seen what's happened. They've seen that their father has demolished the evidence of the prosecution, and anyone with eyes to see would see that this man has not committed the crime he's been accused of. And after a relatively long deliberation of a few hours, the jury come back and he's guilty, guilty, guilty. And Jem says to his father, and Jem, I think, is about 13 at this point, why aren't people like me allowed on the jury? Why isn't Miss Maudie a more liberal-minded woman? Why aren't they allowed on the jury? And his father says, if you were all on the jury, Jem, if there were 12 of you, he would have been acquitted. But that's because you're young and you haven't seen anything of the world. As you get older, he almost implies you will discover that as an older white person on such a jury, a kind of mob mentality will take hold of you. And he doesn't say to him, therefore, hold on to your 13-year-old self. He more or less says, you will discover the way of the world. And the way of the world is you, my son, were you on that jury aged 33, would be a different person than you are now. That's a pretty muted crusade for justice.
Oh, it gets even worse than that, because his next thing that he goes on to say is, and of course we couldn't have people like Miss Maudie on the jury because they'd ask too many questions. If you had women on juries, they'd just be nattering on, like asking questions, getting in the way. And then that's the big criticism of him, right, is that he has accepted a kind of settlement and he wants to nibble at the edges of it. And there's a brilliant article by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker called The Courthouse Ring from 2009, which takes aim at this particular type of white Southern patrician kind of liberalism, in which, the idea was you were essentially okay with segregation, but you weren't going to be a dick about it, right? You weren't going to constantly rub in people's faces that they're inferior status, and how that really melted away in the face of the civil rights movement, because suddenly the demand wasn't just for, certain respectable black people to be treated slightly better. It was actually equality under the law. And that at that point, the Atticus Finches of the world couldn't quite get away from their breeding and their background. And the bit that Gladwell references, which is very true, I had never thought about it when I read it before, is the whole metaphor constantly is this: you have to get inside. You never know what someone's like until you get inside their skin and walk around in it. He says, why should you do that? With Walter Cunningham is at that point a murderous racist, right? He has turned up to lynch what he believes to be an innocent black guy purely so that he doesn't embarrass a white family at the trial. Why do I need to understand this? Why can we not simply condemn it? And I did think that is true. This is what I mean about it being very obviously a book written for white kids preaching a particular type of anti-racism, which is essentially kind of, can't we all just get along and be a bit nicer to each other? It has an unease with radicalism, which you also see in its treatment of gender, right? One of my favourite lines in it is about his scout on femininity, which is, I felt the starched walls of a pink cotton penitentiary closing in on me. And she's such this tomboy. But then at the end, when the women are having their tea party and they're sort of making, what is it, like bovine snuffling sounds as they eat the cakes and they sweat gently in the afternoon and they talk about their missionary work, she sort of realizes that she's got to make peace with that kind of settlement, and she feels okay with it. So for all that it is a book about knocking down prejudice, it's also about what things are you going to accept as well? What bits of the settlement are we okay with?
I don't want this to be a conversation which I then say, and it's worse than that, but there is also a bit which very much stood out to me now. I don't think I would have noticed it before, where either Jem or Scout, I can't remember, says to his or her father, are we allowed to hate Adolf Hitler? And he says, no.
I know.
He doesn't quite say you need to stand in his shoes, but it's the same message. You don't hate anyone. The mission is to understand, equal opportunity understanding across the piece. I was also fascinated by, and I don't even know if class is the word for it. I was thinking it's more caste, C-A-S-T-E, caste, than class, because it's about blood and ancestry and heritage in this very small town, incredibly finely grained caste distinctions. And there are the Ewells who are the bottom of the heap. They are the worst of the whites. The really interesting distinction is between the Finches and the Cunninghams. And again, there's a question one of the kids asks either their father or their aunt, kind of, what's the difference between us and the Cunninghams? Because we're kind of all poor in this town. It's not like the Finches are particularly well off. And the Cunninghams, they do try and lead what they think of as respectable or decent lives. They're out in the woods, but they're actually sticklers, like you say, that the boy won't accept charity at school. He'd rather go hungry than have someone else provide his lunch. These are people not living on the state. The Ewells are. Mr. Ewell just goes and collects his dole check. But these people who are poor as anything are trying to be respectable. And the answer they get is, well, our family learnt to read a lot earlier than they did.
Yeah. And also, their family is into, there's a list of descriptions of the class signifiers is incredible, right? It's about the fact that they like fiddling and they pronounce the word donkey as donkey. I know what you mean. I did think of it as caste, actually, rather than class, because it is so, everything, every word you say, like the geography of where you live, the hobbies that you like, is all just passed through this lens of how respectable you are, how old your family is as well. So as you mentioned before, the Finches come from Finch's Landing, which is their plantation, and the idea that they were a proper old Southern family, people are really incredibly attached to.
And the two key terms are background. So often it's referred to, who are these people? They either have background or they don't have background. And background means you can go back X number of generations, and not having background means not that you're a newcomer, but you can only go back a couple of generations. And then the other key signifier, so this is one of the words that we can use, though a lot of people these days find it offensive, is trash, right? The word trash comes up an awful lot. And one of the questions the kids are always asking is, how do we know who's trash and who isn't trash? And to be trash is to be beyond the pale in all sorts of ways. The great terror of the age is miscegenation and the thought that black and white people might marry and have children. But there's almost an equivalent terror of the mixing of trash and non-trash on the white side. And actually in Go Set A Watchman, that becomes the central theme. Can a Finch marry trash or not? Like, Finch is our background, so someone who's made a decent life for themselves only 2 generations out is a danger to the family. But it's there in this one too. I was really struck as a way, I don't think I would have been reading it earlier. The word trash comes up a lot.
It really does, actually. One of the times that, and again, to speak to what we were talking about before, one of the times when kids at school are throwing around the N-word, I think Scout asks Atticus about it, and he says, don't use it, it's common, which I think is a really telling description, right? Not that it's offensive or it's racist or it's dehumanizing or any of the other ways you might say, but like, that's not something that nice people do, is his way of saying that's unacceptable. Which I think is, again, speaks to this horror, this kind of white patrician horror of consorting with the lower orders. The other character that I never really clocked when I read this earlier is Dolphus Raymond, who is the very rich kind of plantation-y type guy who has a black mistress, a la, Sally Hemings, and a load of mixed-race kids. And everyone just sort of pretends that that's not a thing because he's really rich and therefore he's really rich, he can do what he wants, which reminds me a lot of, I was thinking when I was writing Difficult Women in my history of feminism, writing the chapter about lesbianism about Anne Lister, the landowner, whose life got made into the TV series Gentleman Jack. But the really funny thing about her was that she was just very rich and she owned a lot of land. And so everybody around her just sort of decided to pretend that, not that she wasn't a lesbian, but just be like, oh, Anne, classic Anne, marrying another heiress. What is she like? It was enough, the fact that she was, the kind of idea that rich people essentially can set their own rules. And that's something that, once again, you get in this novel, in the fact that if you're really high up the hierarchy, then you can break the rules if you want to. It's the middle class who are kind of really scrapping, because for them, their position, I guess, is much more liminal. They just really don't want to be downgraded. And I think I went back and reread Nancy Eisenberg's book, White Trash. And she talks a lot about the fact that slavery in the South was used as a sort of sop to the kind of white underclass, which was, you think you've got things bad, and yes, there's a lot of income inequality, but here's a group of people that you're still better than. And it was always kind of this, this kind of sense of, you can feel good about yourselves because you're not at the bottom of the hierarchy, actually. Like, we're not so bad to you. Wouldn't it be worse if it was a free-for-all? And you see that in, some of the writing from the middle 20th century that was very, very worried about the idea of black middle class rising, about the fact that people got, that was going to result in some white people getting kind of downgraded. And I still think that is really applicable to the way that racial hierarchies work in America now. In Arlie Hochschild's brilliant book, Strangers in Their Own Land, which was about the kind of Tea Party movement as it evolved into Trumpism in Louisiana, she had this idea of the deep story of why people were voting for the Tea Party and then for Trump, which was this metaphor of waiting in line to kind of get to the promised land, the kind of golden city over the hill, and then feeling that people were kind of cutting in and that the government was helping them. So women were taking jobs now they got into the workforce, or the black middle class was taking jobs, immigrants were taking jobs, and you got further and further back in the line thanks to all of these people getting a leg up. And where was your leg up? And, whether or not you think that's a fair way of looking for it, I think it's a good explanation of how a lot of people felt at that time, probably still do feel, and a really good explanation about what the segregation offered to a family like the Ewells, right, is that they weren't the absolute bottom of the heap. There was a class of people below them.
That character that you mentioned, the one who has a black wife and mixed race children, one of the signifiers of the fact he has class is, we're told in the book that he's a drunk and he's to be seen drinking whiskey from a brown paper bag, and therefore this sort of explains why he's gone off the rails. It's tolerated because, like you say, he's rich enough that people aren't going to judge him, and every rich family is allowed its eccentricity. So this guy's eccentricities are he's a drunk and he's not married to a white woman. And then he offers a drink to Jem, I think it is, and Jem sips it and says, but it's just Coca-Cola. And as a sign of his class, he says, yeah, I pretend to be a drunk so people are more comfortable with the choices that I've made. So even this guy is like calibrating it really finely. The other character I'd completely forgotten is Mrs. Du Bois. I had no memory of her. So she features in that early part that you mentioned. She's like a Dickensian character, kind of terrifying Miss Havisham character. And the kids are forced to go and read to her because they've cut off the heads of her flowers. And she's nasty. And when they read to her, she keeps falling asleep. But then progressively, she gets more and more alert and nastier. And then she dies. And after she dies, they discover that her secret is that she was a morphine addict. So we're in the age of OxyContin, but 50 years earlier. And Atticus tells the kids that she's a classy woman. She's one of the best women I know because, as befits her class, she was determined not to die an addict. So she did this incredibly brave thing, which is she came off the morphine just when she needed it because she was sick and she was dying and she needed pain relief. And to prove that she wasn't trash, she died clean. It's an extraordinary sequence that seems to come from now, not then. But what makes it then is this woman would rather die in pain than die addicted to morphine, which would have made her a traitor to her class.
I know, I read that bit and I'm like, oh my God, we're reading about opioid addicts in the, poor rural South. And I'm sure the book made you think, as it made me think of Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, which is her retelling of David Copperfield, which is set in a, not in exactly the same part of America geographically, but with the same kind of themed of underclass and also of opioid addiction. And, there is a similar, not exactly Puritanism, but there is a similar kind of feeling about that the respectability comes from self-control, and that, that it's only morally deficient people who succumb to addiction, that doesn't happen to the respectable middle class, which is obviously not true. I think you could probably say that, tough life circumstances make you more prone to some types of addiction, but it's not like, I could find you any number of very wealthy American cocaine addicts. It's not a unique problem to any particular economic stratus. But yeah, it is fascinating that there are things that Harper Lee is writing about in the 50s, the book was published in 1960, are still so unbelievably relevant now. Also, I would just say, is Mrs. Du Bois really a nice person? This is another bit where I want to kind of call out Atticus Finch for his ideas. Like, all we ever see of her is her just being atrociously racist and cranky.
She's a terrible person.
I get that she's coming off the drugs and there's no kind of methadone, but you never see her do a single kind thing for anybody. She appears to only like her, whatever it is, begonias, petunias, peonies, whatever it is. She's never got a good word for anyone in the entire novel, but yet we're assured by Atticus that she's actually she's very lovely.
Yeah, and it's not like when she's on the drugs, she's nice. She's nasty, but she falls asleep. The only benefit of her being on the morphine is that she's only got 20 minutes of nastiness in her. And as she comes off it, it goes on for hours and hours, and the hours and hours are ranting. I've also been thinking about Demon Copperhead. I was thinking about it for a couple of reasons just now, one of which is, I don't know if you've been following it, but the New York Times has been doing a series about the great books of this century. And they polled like critics and writers and this and that. And the book that came number one was Elena Ferrante, sort of good critics' choice. But then they also asked their readers. Their readers' number one was Demon Copperhead. In the same way, I'm sure if you asked their readers the best book of the 20th century, it would probably, critics wouldn't do it now. They wouldn't dream of doing it now. Or indeed probably writers. But I suspect readers would make To Kill a Mockingbird number one. I mean, Demon Copperhead has almost assumed the mantle of the To Kill a Mockingbird of the 21st century. But the other reason I was thinking about it was I read a review of Demon Copperhead that said, to people who've read it and who've read David Copperfield, part of the fun is, she really does map the character onto character. And as you're reading it, you're thinking, who's going to be Uriah Heep? Who's going to be Mr. Micawber? And there they come and the names, and it's fun. But this review said the one bit that doesn't work is Demon Copperhead. He doesn't map on to David Copperfield, because the point of the David Copperfield story is that he becomes Charles Dickens. That's what we are meant to know throughout that book. This is the story, an extraordinary story of a boy, not actually in the David Copperfield case born in that much poverty, but who lands in poverty, and in a decade turns himself into the person we can see within another decade is going to be one of the most famous people in the world, one of the titans of England. And this review said, for it to map on to David Copperfield, because Demon Copperhead, he survives, he's a survivor, but he doesn't escape. And he doesn't follow that trajectory. You don't think he's on the cusp of becoming a world historical figure. This review said it would need him to become a reality TV star and then president of the United States. So David Copperfield is J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is the person so he's not Demon Copperhead, but he's David Copperfield, whose story does follow that arc. After all, within a couple of decades, he's gone from his hillbilly background. Well, he is now potentially one step away from being not the next, but the next but one president of the United States.
Yeah, I would say he's the heir apparent at this point. And I read Hillbilly Elegy back in 2017 when it was, it was when I have to say a time in which J.D. Vance was extremely anti-Trump, very amusingly, right? He wrote an article for The Atlantic about the fact that he called Donald Trump the opiate of the masses. He said, he's like fentanyl in the communities that I came from. He's promising this relief and it's poison. Update regarding that. No, he doesn't think that anymore. He thinks Donald Trump is great. But you're right, it was the same kind of story. It was Middleton, Ohio, where he grew up. And that was a similar type of post-industrial community that had been hollowed out. He was raised by his grandmother, Mamor, as he calls her, because his mum was an opiate addict. And he got from there to, law school and then to working for Peter Thiel, and then from thence to the Republican Party Senator of Ohio, and now vice presidential pick on the Republican ticket. So there is still a kind of social mobility path, but I know what you mean. I think the way that Demon Copperhead is written in full knowledge that people don't think that those great engines of social mobility exist anymore. They don't think that actually respectable middle class work is kind of achievable if you come from those kind of backgrounds. Maybe you can be the 1 in a million person who gets the golden ticket and does something extraordinary, but it's the escalator is broken, I think, is probably the knowledge in which that book is written.
When I was watching J.D. Vance's speech, and I had been thinking this David Copperfield comparison, but the difference is David Copperfield's mother dies, Demon Copperhead's mother died. That's the engine of those stories. And J.D. Vance introduced his mother at the convention, 10 years sober and clean. And that is the difference between those stories. I mean, he was raised by Mormor, but she also survived. It is actually a tale of survivors, which, a lot of the people in the Demon Copperhead David Copperfield story, they don't survive.
No, and I had that exact. I haven't read David Copperfield due to being a bit of a Dickens avoider, but I've watched Amanda Nucci's very good film, so I do at least know all the characters. And there was a bit when you kind of went, "Oh, his nickname's U-Haul. Okay, so he's going to be Uriah Heep or whoever it might be." And to some extent, I think I'm basing this on my knowledge of Dickens films, really. But I think one of his successes was creating those big characters that feel kind of not caricature-like, but they feel larger than life kind of archetypes, whilst also bristling with life. I'm trying to work out whether or not I think that, does Atticus Finch feel like that to you? Does he feel like a kind of transcendental character that you can think of other people who have assets like him, or you think fondly of him? Because I know I have friends who think, who sort of worshipped Atticus Finch. I know somebody who called a kid after him before Go Set A Watchman came out, which was awkward. And I never quite felt like that about him. I respected him without kind of necessarily loving him, I suppose.
Yeah, reading it this time, he wasn't the person who made me cry. It was Scout and Boo. But he is a remarkable character, and he is clearly a version of the ideal father. It's his relationship with his children. It's the way that when everyone is always saying, not in front of the kids, you can't say that to the kids, he tells them, he answers their questions. He's pretty strict with them, but he feels like a man with his kids from whom they will get a straight answer, including answers that are deeply depressing about his pessimism and his fatalism and the rest of it. So I have now read Go Set A Watchman. It is quite hard to think of him in the same light, because in Go Set A Watchman, he's a racist, he's a segregationist, and it's a very different kind of book. And it's a baffling book to understand, because we're meant to believe it was written before To Kill a Mockingbird, but it's set 20 years afterwards. And it's quite hard to know how the same writer could have somehow anticipated what she was going to write about these characters, and yet these characters don't seem to fit. In reading To Kill a Mockingbird, I was on the lookout for the politics and things I definitely would have noticed as a child, but it connects these two books slightly weirdly. In To Kill a Mockingbird, it begins by saying this was an optimistic time in Macomb County, because we'd just been told we had nothing to fear but fear itself. And the New Deal has just been launched. And the thing about the New Deal was that the way Roosevelt got it through was he made a pact with the South, with the Jim Crow South, with their legislators in the Senate and in Congress. There was no way of passing this legislation without Southern votes. So the Faustian pact was, if you allow me to build these government programs, they will not come with any strings attached about how you distribute them in your own backyard. That is, there will not be any racial justice attached to this. Your racial hierarchy will be left untouched. So the whites in Macomb County are big fans of Roosevelt and the New Deal. They're suspicious of Eleanor Roosevelt, we discover. She's dangerous. But FDR, they clearly worship him. He was the politician of the Democratic South. And then by the end of the book, they're pessimistic. And there's a really telling little bit at the end of the book where we're told times have changed and the NRA stickers, the National Recovery Act stickers, have gone. And I think Scout or Jem says to her father, where have they gone? And he said, it's been taken away from us by 9 men in Washington. Like the Supreme Court has blocked the New Deal, not because they want racial justice, but because they don't want government intervention. But in that book, Atticus Finch is all for the government coming into the South to give them money. In Go Set A Watchman, he's also railing against the Supreme Court. He is absolutely full of vicious, very recognizable contemporary rhetoric about these men ruining the South, not because they blocked the New Deal, but because of Brown versus Board of Education and the fact that the Warren Court is now the engine of racial justice in the South.
So Brown versus Board of Education is school desegregation, isn't it? It's that one. School
desegregation. And Go Set A Watchman is set in the 50s.
This is why I didn't read it. I started reading it because, the background to it is very murky, that Harper Lee, after it's sort of the kind of mythical tale, publishes one perfect book that everybody loves, that sells millions of copies, and then retires back to Monroe, Alabama, and doesn't really give any publicity, doesn't do any interviews. She's just this kind of enigma. And then very close to the end of her life, when she appears to be living in, I think, in an assisted care facility, suddenly a new Harper Lee book's going to come out. And I think people felt very queasy about that, about the fact that she had been very clear all the way through her life. She didn't want another book to come out. And now at this time, when she doesn't seem to be maybe in full control of her faculties anymore, mysteriously a new Harper Lee book was coming out. So I was prejudiced against it from that. And then I started reading it, and all of about 6 pages in, she kills off Jem in like one line. It just goes, and of course my brother died quite soon after that. And you're like, whoa, Jem, what are you doing to Jem? And Atticus by this point is in his 70s and has got rheumatoid arthritis. And I thought, no, I just don't want to ruin To Kill a Mockingbird. That was her, not we should give into the, author's intention is everything. But I thought, I just think that's a book that should stand on its own, and it was a complete artwork. And I don't want to read some weirdo knockoff version that, because it's not quite like fan fiction, like kind of abusing characters, because it obviously was written by her at one point, but when she was fully with it, she didn't want that book published. But it's very hard, because I know it would sort of spoil my enjoyment of To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think that impulse is actually really common. When you think about all the people who are upset about updated curriculums, particularly in America, or I've just seen today Elon Musk tweeting about the fact that, all this, Marvel characters are now black and all this kind of stuff. Those people who feel like their kind of culture is being taken away from them. That is sort of a bit how I feel about like the potential loss of being allowed to kind of like To Kill a Mockingbird anymore, because I then found out retrospectively everybody in it turns out to have been awful. So it was quite a good sympathetic experience for me, I suppose, that one.
And the Malcolm Gladwell piece that you refer to, that was written well before Go Set A Watchman came out. And I'm afraid, now having read it, the Go Set A Watchman story confirms everything that Malcolm Gladwell was saying about this character, Atticus Finch, and the wider intellectual background that informs his motivations. Because he does in Go Set A Watchman, the racism is clear, the segregationism is clear. It's consistent that the thing he wants to defend is, in Macomb County, we do it our own way. And it may take time. In To Kill a Mockingbird, the implication is it may take time. But if you force it on us, you will wreck it. You will wreck this careful balance where decent, respectable people have found a way for these very finely grained castes to coexist. And if Washington or the NAACP, who are the other villains in Go Set A Watchman, come in with their bludgeoning social science ways, they will just obliterate all these fine distinctions on which our society depends. So he is recognized to be the same person. The difference is, To Kill a Mockingbird is the most charming book. I mean, it's got charm dripping off it.
Oh, it's beautiful, yeah.
And Go Set A Watchman is completely charmless. It is, I mean, I can tell you, you're not missing anything. It is an utterly charmless book. And the 20-something scout is a charmless character. It's almost impossible to believe it was written by the same person.
That's fascinating. Yes, you're right. It's like just the bit when she dresses up as a ham in the last bit and they have the pageant, and they have this mad pageant where all the kids are dressed as beans and stuff like that, like the worst school assembly ever. It's just very, very sweet. But I know what you mean. The criticism that is often made of kind of centrists on Twitter by the kind of radical left is that they're quote unquote sensibles, and that they're obsessed with tone, and they don't really want anything to change as long as people aren't just being awful and kind of, and nasty and mean. And I did think about the kind of validity of that criticism when at the end Maudie says, well, isn't it great that, the judge gave Atticus this case and he prosecuted it, and it actually took the jury several hours to convict Tom Robinson. And I thought, none of that is going to be really that much consolation to Tom Robinson, who has now been shot to death, or his widow and their orphans, who are now, reliant on Link D's to give her a job in the shop, at which she then gets harassed by Bob Ewell as she walks to work every day, right? And I think there is an acknowledgement of that in the book, because in that ladies' tea party scene, do you remember that the one who's obsessed with the missionary, who is actually a kind of Dickensian character, right? She loves doing stuff about people in Africa because they're properly grateful, but she gets very upset about the fact that her cook was very downcast about the verdict and really took it to heart. And she says she calls her sulky. And, and says how awful it is when the help, they just don't put on a good Christian countenance. So I think there is an acknowledgement that kind of respectability politics can be, a kind of cover for basically just being okay with the status quo. But the other bit that sprung to mind is also the bit when the kids go to the segregated balcony. The Reverend takes them up there because there's no space to sit. 4 black people get up and give them their seats instantly. And that's noted but never mentioned. And the idea that even a child who has arrived late takes precedence over somebody who, presumably if they're sitting in the front row, got there very early to queue, and that's something that just is totally accepted, is now quite quite shocking. And I think symptomatic of the kind of the hierarchy that the book is not necessarily okay with, but doesn't feel is the kind of screaming injustice. So, those hints about the feelings about segregation, I think, are there in To Kill a Mockingbird.
And I found myself thinking that there is a flaw in Atticus's long-term prospectus for progress. I don't know, he probably wouldn't even use the word progress, but for a more decent world is probably the way he would put it. He says this will take time and we can't have outsiders coming in to tell us what to do. But the belief of people in Macomb County is actually because they believe in background and caste and heritage. Nobody changes. I mean, it's absolutely central to their worldview that your character traits are not formed by your experiences. They are formed by your inheritance. And each family has its distinctive characteristics, which are either quaint or appalling, depending on your perspective. And family is all. And weirdly, the only character in the book who comes close to changing, I mean, there are two moments of change in the book. The celebrated one where, the one you mentioned, the lynch mob is going to lynch Tom Robinson. And, Atticus himself may have been injured or killed. And he's saved by his daughter because she shames Walter Cunningham by reminding him that she has a relationship with his son. And it causes him to change in the sense that they back off. So it's not a Damascene conversion. But then one of the questions that the children have about the jury is, why did the jury convict? And the jury is Cunningham's. So the jury is not trashy Ewells, and it's not respectable people. So they're told respectable people won't sit on a jury. It's one of the weird things about the town. They won't sit on a jury and they'll find an excuse not to sit on a jury because they don't want to have to do these terrible compromise things because they couldn't acquit, but they don't want to be seen to convict when the man clearly didn't do it. So it's not the trash who are on the jury. It's like one notch up the Cunninghams. And then it takes them a few hours to convict and the kids say that was quick. And he says, no, that was slow. It normally takes them 3 minutes to convict. And he's discovered that there was one Henry Fonda holdout. But unfortunately, it's not 12 Angry Men because he just in the end gets browbeaten. But the holdout is a Cunningham. And the thought is, I don't think it's Walter Cunningham, I think it's another Cunningham, but the thought is something about that experience of the lynch mob standing down then changed at least one of those people's views, but not so much that he didn't, in the end, vote guilty. If that's the hope for progress, it's going to take an awfully long time.
Yeah, and that also speaks to one fact. I mean, you mentioned the word before, but this is definitely a book that is concerned with miscegenation. And it took until what was it, 1960? I think maybe the same year the book came out that you have Loving versus Virginia, which overturns the idea that you can have anti-miscegenation laws. And it's specifically, it's not Dolphus, it's not white men with black women. It's the idea of black men with white women is particularly terrifying to the white men who sit on the jury and hold all the power. And the thing that they have to kind of protect and the thing that's so awful about the case is the idea that May Ellie Ewell was sexually attracted to Tom Robinson and he was nice to her because he felt that she was lonely. That is the bit that kind of absolutely, that's the taboo. Him saying that is a thing that it really radically reduces sympathy for him among the courtroom. They all kind of gasp in horror. But the other thing that comes out of that is the fact that Atticus's cross-examination is incredibly brutal to May Ellie Ewell, who we discover in the course of this has been repeatedly raped and beaten up by her father, completely lonely and abused, and has essentially been forced into taking this rape case in order to kind of quote unquote defend her virtue, really. That's the only way that, her father caught her trying to kiss a black man and she's had to go along with this idea that it was non-consensual. And that is, because it's such a classic novel, you kind of forget that is quite a lot of radical ideas with which to hit 8 to 10-year-olds, right? With which to hit school classrooms, particularly in the context of America, where, the idea of miscegenation is behind a huge number of lynchings. It is something that is this kind of folk fear for decades. And actually, some of the language that's used about Tom Robinson, he's called boy, and he's also referred to as buck, which is this very sexualized word for a black man that you still see in kind of strange interracial porn now. And, those things I think are kind of fascinating about the idea that the stereotypes and kind of way that that kind of black man is dismissed and the absolute fear of a black man and a white woman being together is still such, I think, something that slightly haunts America now, actually.
I think Malcolm Gladwell makes this point that when you read it, as you say, the cross-examination of Maya Ewell is horrifying. And at the back of it, there's a calculation on Atticus's part. It's not clear if he ever believes he can get Tom Robinson off, but he has to do his duty, and his duty is to make the best case that he can. And the implication of the case that he makes is, as it were, leave her to her father. We will make clear what we think has happened in order to get this guy off. But whereas it's going to leave that intact, it's not like there's sympathy for her or anything like that. It's just that's what you will get in those families. But if we understand that, at least we will understand that the miscegenation event didn't take place. So you can let this guy off. It's almost like saying to the jury, white trash raping a white daughter is something you can live with. And I'm sparing you the thing that you can't live with, which is the idea that this man and this woman had sex. The thing, as you say, that undermines it, and probably even the one jury member who was thinking of acquitting can't get past, is when Tom Robinson says, I felt sorry for her. And that's as bad in a way as him saying, and I kissed her, because that crosses all of the boundaries that whole community exists to uphold.
The other bit I noticed from the courtroom scene that I didn't clock before is the fact that Bob Ewell's full name is Robert E. Lee Ewell. So he is named after the kind of great Confederate general who is the one who signs the South surrender, right? And himself said in the aftermath that he didn't want huge amounts of monuments to the kind of Confederacy because he wanted to, promote unity. And then really within a couple of years of his death, people started putting up Robert E. Lee statues. And the last couple of years of American history have seen a huge number of those statues come down again. There was a stained glass window in the cathedral in Washington. There was a statue in Charlottesville of Robert E. Lee that came down, and Charlottesville being the place where the big Unite the Right rally, the alt-right rally, happened in the Trump years in 2017 with the tiki torches, the very fine people on both sides. And I think that's a bit that I hadn't really also picked up. You get the kind of, when you're young, you get the idea of the South as a vibe, the American South as a vibe. So it's kind of verandas and iced lemonade and, people gently kind of fanning themselves and saying, I do declare. But you don't get the sense of a political entity that still feels very bitter about having been on the losing side of a war. And that's what I think coming to this novel as an adult, I really got. That this is about a kind of defeated, not exactly conquered country, but one that felt that it had to make huge concessions that were probably unfair. And it's now being kind of dictated to by the north of the country still, decades after that war ended.
And actually, we're told that Macomb County in Alabama, there's one reference to the Civil War, which in this book is called the War Between the States. And we're told when one of the children is being given a history of their family, that the war between the states left Macomb County alone. It sort of passed it by. So it wasn't even defeated in a sense. There was this war between the states, not a civil war, but a war between the states. And Macomb County continued unchanged before, during, and after. There is still a bitter memory of Reconstruction, but Reconstruction came to an end. Weirdly, in Go Set A Watchman, the person who gives an interminable and completely bonkers history lesson is Uncle Jack, Atticus's brother. He's called Jack, isn't he?
Oh, the one who becomes a doctor, who I strongly believe to be gay, but that's just my personal headcanon.
Right. Well, and if you read Go Set A Watchman, you will also strongly believe to be mad. And he's very eccentric by this point. He's eccentric Dr. Jack, but he gives the 20-something scout a much fuller history lesson about why people in that part of the South will not accept outsiders coming in and telling them how to reorder their affairs. They have to do it for themselves. And it explicitly has nothing to do with the Civil War because it goes back before that. And it's about when they came across the ocean, the kind of people who came across the ocean, how they saw off the Catholics. And I noticed in To Kill a Mockingbird, at one point, one of the kids says, and what about the Catholics? And, we don't have Catholics here. We've never seen a Catholic. That's even beyond. We'll talk about the Jews, but we won't even talk about the Catholics.
Well, there's a very weird, the only reference, apart from the bit when she talks about how Hitler's being terribly beastly to the Jews, and Atticus says, maybe let's, think about, why you might be like that. There is one reference that Atticus makes to the Ku Klux Klan going around. And the Ku Klux Klan targeted Jews as well as black people.
And Catholics.
And Catholics, right? And then it's a bit about how someone with Sam Levy, I think he's got a kind of Jewish coded name, stood on his porch and basically just told them to just could you not just get off my lawn? And then they weren't very scary and they went away. And that's a very weird moment as well, when you're like, this sort of belief that, you could just, because the whole, if you read the histories of the Klan, they talk about the fact that, they presented cartoonishly in a way that gave them sort of plausible deniability. You know, the kind of the hoods and the kind of going around and that stuff was sort of carnivalesque in the way of like, oh, you're not meant to take us seriously. We're all just, you know, we're play acting at the same time as perpetrating these incredible acts of violence. So again, it's another kind of slightly scrubby mark against Atticus that he has brought into this mythology that the clan was essentially like the sort of Rotary Club, but with a few slightly recondite views on race mixing, rather than being an organisation ruled by murderous psychopaths who were completely prepared to resort to vigilante violence against anything they didn't like.
And Scout, whose role in this is often to ask the question that the reader is thinking but no one else is asking. In the Hitler bit, when they're learning that Hitler, and this is 35, 36, so actually I'm quite impressed that the news has reached the American South that Hitler is persecuting the Jews. And she asks her teacher, what's the difference? Or maybe she asks Jem, actually. She doesn't ask the teacher, she asks Jem, what's the difference between what Hitler's doing to the Jews and kind of what we do here? And the teacher's answer, which she writes up on the board and underlines in capital letters, is "We are a democracy," which is a bit rich and not completely plausible. But the other thing that's chilling about that is it is now well known that Hitler studied and admired the Dixie South. It was the one political order that he thought the Nazis could really learn from. And there's quite a lot in Nazi writing about, and including from Hitler himself, about thinking that the correct answer to Scout's question is there isn't a difference.
And a lot of the work on eugenics, right? The Americans were incredibly enthusiastic proponents of eugenics, which was, again, something that I think the Nazis felt that they could learn from. The infamous Supreme Court judgment about sterilizing the mentally unfit, which said, you know, was it 3 generations of idiots or 3 generations of imbeciles is enough? That's Buck versus Bell. So yeah, there was a kind of cross-pollination between different people who really believed in, you know, the horrors of race mixing. And I suppose to that teacher, the answer, you know, you can't really say the Warsaw Ghetto is terrible. However, the way that we make our Negro population live in this one bit beyond the dump that's obviously supposed to be horrible, that is okay. And they're different because of reasons. But what's kind of fascinating about the novel is that you're constantly trying to unpick what's the naivety of Scout and what's the narrator telling you things but not landing on them, and you're supposed to be, you know, take them away. And what are the prejudices that are still there in Harper Lee and the assumptions that she's making still in 1960 that are not how we think today? And for me, I also just love it as a novel because, I mean, you said it before, I can pick any number of holes in it and find things in it that are just weird. But the texture of it is just incredible. Like, just even to give you another example, Calpurnia, the black servant, takes the kids to her church, her black church. It's called First Purchase. The idea being that it was the first thing they bought when they were emancipated from slavery, that everyone saved up and bought it and founded a church. And she gets verbally abused by a woman at that church for being too friendly with white people. You know, she's accused of being company. Essentially, she's accused of sleeping with Atticus. She's too friendly. So there are people on the black side too who also regard race mixing with kind of suspicion, that people should stick to their own kind. And that's a kind of subtlety that just for a children's book is, again, it's never remarked upon, but it's there. And I just find for a book that feels very tight and slim, there's just so much, like, the richness of To Kill a Mockingbird is insane.
And as you say, every page delivers something. And I have to say, I don't think I have cried at a book for a long, long time. And I came to this one armed. I had a conversation with a historian a few days ago saying I'm reading To Kill a Mockingbird and I'm aware of this revisionism. What is the view of the American historical profession about this? And we had a conversation about it. And he said something which was very interesting. Which is one way to think about this is that another real historical character who's been significantly revised is Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson, the American president, a product of the South and of this South, you know, the respectable South, but the racist South, and who was a believer in segregation. And he was a believer in segregation for the reasons essentially that the people of Macomb County are, which is that he believed that the key thing in America was to keep white trash apart from black people, not just because of miscegenation, but also because if you don't, they'll lynch them. And actually, you know, in this patrician way, the view was, you know, if Northerners come in and force us to mix, we won't just get mixed race children. We'll also get a lot more violence because these kind of white people just do not know how to be around black people. So the job of respectable white people is to protect black people by keeping them apart. And so I read this book with that in mind, and it really sort of, you know, desentimentalized me. And yet I was howling like a baby at the end. And Woodrow Wilson had gone out the window, you know, history lessons had gone out the window. And something to me about the character of Boo Radley, who in some weird way, he's to one side of all of the stuff we've been talking about. The race question doesn't really enter into it with Boo Radley. But when Boo is standing against the wall, it broke my heart.
And it does a very, very good thing, which is that you are there. The central act of the book is the attempted lynching, which is an act of vigilante violence. And then by the end, Boo kills Bob Ewell, right? Bob Ewell attacks the kids on their way home. He stabs Scout, but luckily her ham costume protects her. And then he manages to break Jem's arm. And then Boo Radley comes out with a kitchen knife, stabs him underneath the ribs. Yeah, he comes up with a kitchen knife, doesn't he? Because then the sheriff later turns up on the back porch with a flick knife, and Atticus says, "Where did you get that? And why was he killed with a kitchen knife?" And you put it together in your mind that obviously that's Bob Ewell's flick knife, which the sheriff is now hiding the evidence of this crime. And Boo Radley came out of his kitchen with the kitchen knife. And you would have to have a heart of stone not to just be totally okay with the fact that Boo Radley is going to get away with that killing. Yes, it was incredibly obviously self-defense, but just not to put him on trial, that just a couple of the senior men in the town just stitched up this case and decided what's justice. And I remember thinking, this is fascinating. Like, the first time I'm reading this, I'm like, I am just totally okay with extrajudicial stuff as long as I agree with it. Which is a kind of brilliant note for the book to end on, really, after having put you through this paces of how you feel about, the importance of the rule of law. That at the end you go, oh no, you don't need the law. Boo Radley's a good man. He doesn't deserve to be put on trial and exposed to Maycomb. He just needs to go back in his house and whittle some soap figurines. Poor lad.
And then everything else will just take time. And yeah, the power of this book is by the end, you're wrung out. You haven't got time for the complicated, deeply complicated political, historical reservations you might have. I just had to sort of pull myself together and dry my eyes.
Oh, that's nice. But to be able to have that much texture and also make you feel emotions, like, that's what I mean about it being a didactic book. But I can't think of another didactic book that is so successful at being also an incredibly brilliant emotional journey and an incredibly brilliant evocation of a particular time and place. You can feel the kind of ceiling fans and the midday heat and the little post office, and people probably still using horse and carts, even though the car has been invented long before. Yeah, it does have a kind of magic to it that it's now 30 years since I first read it, and that spell really hasn't broken.
Coming soon, we're going to be beginning a new series about what ifs in history, counterfactuals, the ways in which, with just a little kink in the road, the world we live in might have been very different. But before that, I want to tell you about 2 more episodes we've got in the Great Political Fiction series. In our regular slot on Sunday, something a bit different and a bit special. In this one, I'm actually going to be talking to the person who wrote the Great Political Fiction in question. It's another musical to go with Hamilton, and I think it is also one of the great pieces of political drama. It's Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber's Evita, and I'm going to be talking to Tim Rice about the inspiration behind that musical, what he was thinking about when he wrote it, what he thinks about the politics, and how his view of it has changed in the 40 plus years since it came out. But we do also have another bonus episode which is available now. You will need to subscribe to PPF Plus in order to hear it. It's very easy. Just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. And this episode is me talking about what I think is maybe the great political fiction of the 21st century. Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, an extraordinary book in its own right, but also an extraordinary book to read in the age of Donald Trump. Here's a taster. As so much of this book, what's so fascinating about Roth's depiction of American fascism is not how fascist it is, but how American it is. It is much more, in some ways, American than it is, by European standards, fascist. And this is an example of that, because after all, what the Office of American Absorption is doing and is self-consciously doing is something that it presents to Jews, but also to non-Jews, as just an extension of what America has always done, which is to try to assimilate immigrants. It happens in this case that a belief has taken hold that Jews haven't assimilated quite enough. And so they're going to be helped and encouraged. But they're going to be encouraged not to become fascists, and they're not going to be herded in concentration camps and wiped out. They're not going to be persecuted, so they're told. They are simply going to be given an opportunity to experience America outside of the ghetto. And the focus of this scheme is on young Americans who are going to be sent to live in other parts of the country in order to learn a bit about the other America. So it's more like summer camp than it is like Dachau. Subscribe to PPF Plus in order to hear that and to get all of our bonus episodes. You get 24 bonus episodes a year, you get ad-free listening, you get automatically signed up to our newsletter. £50 for the whole year or £5 a month. Just go to ppfideas.com. Next, in our main slot, Tim Rice on Evita. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.